Hi, everyone. My name is Iris Cahill-Cassiano. I'm one of the psychology doctoral interns here at Texas A&M University's Counseling and Psychological Services. Today, I'm bringing you another video installment from our Anxiety Toolbox video series, and we're going to be focusing this particular video on unhelpful thinking styles. Let's dive in. So hopefully you've checked out the earlier video that talks about the cognitive model. For a really quick summary, I'm just going to run through this super fast. In a nutshell, the cognitive model gives us a way of understanding how our anxiety process might work. And it's essentially that our thoughts influence our feelings or emotions, which then influence our behaviors, which then feed right back into thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and so forth. We end up in a cycle. And oftentimes we also have these physical sensations that come up, and it's a physiological response to what's going on. So that's the cognitive model in a nutshell. Today, we're going to really focus on the thoughts piece, because part of what's helpful of understanding this perspective on how the anxiety process works is that we can now start looking for places where we can eventually interrupt this anxiety cycle. So we're going to focus on thoughts today. And why thoughts? Well, because they often start the anxiety cycle. Remember, our thoughts, from the perspective of this model, really are offering us an interpretation of a situation, right? They're framing how we understand what's going on. And for those of us who are more visual thinkers, maybe these are images or they might show up as sort of like pictures that flash through our mind. In either case, it's our way of really evaluating and understanding what is happening to us. Eventually, these thoughts can actually feed into thought patterns, which become habit over time. And they often occur really fast and really quickly, so we're not even aware that this is going on. So, what are some of these unhelpful thought patterns that might evolve from anxiety? Let's think about these as our brain macros, okay? These are shortcuts that our brain uses to help us evaluate and understand a situation as quickly as possible. In many ways, our brain is very fantastic and creative and imaginative, but it also uses these kinds of shortcuts to be able to help us navigate things quickly and efficiently. So that's the key part here. These shortcuts happen fast and often without our awareness, right? They've kind of sort of just been programmed into our brain. And people tend to have their go-to thinking styles. And here's the key part too. Everybody engages at some point in these unhelpful thinking styles, not just folks who experience anxiety. It's just especially helpful for folks who are experiencing anxiety to start to recognize, okay, when do these thoughts that I'm experiencing match up with an unhelpful pattern that isn't going to be productive for me? But before we even get there, let's review some of these unhelpful thinking styles. And as I go through them one by one, start thinking about which of these resonate with you. Like, what do you notice yourself actually kind of engaging in? Feel free to take notes because I'll circle back to this later on in the presentation. So our first unhelpful thinking style is all or nothing thinking. This is sometimes referred to as black or white thinking, but it's essentially like it says, it's all or nothing. You're either in it to win it or don't bother. So a really good example might be a student that tells himself, if I don't have a 4.0 this semester, I'm not a good student. Another unhelpful thinking style, mental filter. This is when you only pay attention to certain kinds of evidence around you. And in the case of anxiety or any kind of unhelpful thinking, it's usually a filtering out positive information in order to privilege negative information. So a good example is we only ever notice or pay attention to or receive criticism from people, like a critique, and then it's very hard to accept or hear like positive things or compliments, right? We tend to only see failures and not notice success. Jumping to conclusions is another very common unhelpful thinking style, where essentially there's two types. You're either mind reading, which is you know exactly what other people are thinking, or you're fortune telling, which is somehow you're able to predict the future. So, some examples of these might be in terms of mind reading, somebody telling themselves, I know my friend is really upset with me. Of course, they've had no conversation with their friend and they don't actually know that, but they're mind reading. Another example for the fortune telling is somebody that tells themselves, like, oh, I know I'm going to fail this exam. I just know it. It's like, exam hasn't happened yet. How do you know that you're going to fail this exam? Emotional reasoning. This one gets a little bit sticky. Essentially, it's the assumption that just because you feel a certain way, the thought must be true. So, like, if you feel embarrassed, it must mean you're an idiot. Or another really good one is that's pretty common as I feel ashamed. I feel so much shame and guilt. I know I must have done something bad. The problem with that is just because you feel something doesn't mean that it is objectively true. And this is where it gets sticky because sometimes we're told, like, trust your gut, trust your instinct, listen to your feelings. And sometimes that's helpful, but a lot of the times our feelings might be kind of aligning with the anxiety or with depression or something else, and aren't really giving you a true objective perspective. So you have to be cautious with the emotional reasoning piece. Labeling is another unhelpful thinking style that's super common, where people will assign labels to themselves. Great examples here, like a lot of negative self talk, like I'm a loser, I'm completely useless, or labeling other people like, oh, they're so dumb or they're such idiots. This labeling is really attacking kind of the self instead of being a response to the situation. Overgeneralizing. This is when we see a pattern based on one event, or we tend to paint with a very broad paintbrush based on one tiny piece of evidence. So, for example, maybe a student has a really bad quiz day, like they do bad on one quiz, and then they overgeneralize and are like, oh, I'm such a terrible student. I never do well on any exam that I ever take. But really, they're just responding to that one bad quiz. And who doesn't have a bad quiz from time to time, right? Disqualifying the positive. This is discounting good things that have happened or that you have done for some reason or another. So, like, let's say you have a really good test day, or a student has a really good test day, and they come out and they're like, wow, I got a 98% on this test. It's not because I studied hard. I just got lucky. Or it was an easy test. The teacher didn't really make it hard. I didn't really earn that A. So disqualifying the positive is, so again, like turning that negative lens towards the self and discounting good things that happen. Magnification is also known sometimes as catastrophizing, or being very catastrophic with things. It's when we blow stuff out of proportion. Or, the opposite, the flip side of that is that we minimize it. So we either take something that's a really small deal and make it huge, or we take something that's actually a really big deal and then try to make it small. And I'll give a couple of examples. Catastrophizing, a great example is the student that does poorly on a quiz, and that they tell themselves, wow, I did really bad on this quiz. I know I'm going to fail the test. And oh my gosh, that means I'm going to fail this class, and I'm going to fail the semester, and I'm going to drop out of school. And next thing you know, I'll be living under a bridge. That's catastrophizing, right? They went from 0 to 60 based on one little thing that happened. For somebody who minimizes, it could be maybe the complete opposite of that, where somebody is doing really poorly in a lot of exams, and then they tell themselves, like, it's not that big a deal. So what if it looks like I might flunk the semester? It doesn't really matter. And that's the minimizing side of this coin. Ooh, should and must statements. This is an unhelpful thinking style in the sense that these are very critical, very almost judgmental kind of words that are intended to make us feel guilty or imply that we've already failed, that there was something that was unavoidable or preventable, and that, as an individual, we failed to prevent that or do it. We usually apply shoulds to other people when we're frustrated. The problem with this should and must is it's such an absolute word. And the truth is, there are very few things that are 100% absolute. And so this just really kind of circles or churns the guilt butter, so to speak. Personalizing. This is taking maybe a lot of responsibility for something that wasn't completely your fault, or blaming somebody else and assuming that they're 100% responsible for what went wrong. This personalizing thing, again, attacks an individual, attacks the self, and it doesn't really get at the fact that this was a situation or an event that happened. So it's a very internal, personal kind of thing. And it tends to be unhelpful because it keeps us kind of stuck in that rut of whose fault is it? Now, let's practice identifying some unhelpful thinking styles. If you need to, feel free to pause and go back, but I'll also give you some of the answers here. Here's a nice example. Jay, just an Aggie student walking down the street and sees a friend. The friend is walking towards them, but walks completely by and doesn't, say hello or wave or anything. Jay thinks to himself, whew, my friend is definitely really mad at me for some reason. What unhelpful thinking style might this be? If you said jumping to conclusions, then you are correct. So this falls into that mind reading type of jumping to conclusions. There was no interaction with this friend. We really don't know what happened. And Jay is just assuming that the person is mad at him for no reason. So what if Jay thinks, okay, same scenario, but Jay thinks my friend is definitely really mad at me and they don't want to be my friend anymore. I'm going to end up totally alone with no friends. What unhelpful thinking style could this be? If you said magnification or catastrophizing, then you're correct. I mean, this is a great example of something that starts with mind reading. Again, Jay is making that assumption that the friend is mad at him, but then it quickly escalates into the friend not wanting to be buddies with him anymore. And then now Jay is going to end up totally alone and spend the rest of his life without any friends. There's no evidence for this. Jay goes from 0 to 60 and makes a very big personal deal out of something that's really he doesn't have any evidence for. We would definitely call this magnifying or catastrophizing. So now I invite you all to identify some of your go-to unhelpful thinking styles. Think about, what unhelpful thinking patterns do you tend to engage in most often? And how does this thinking style end up actually affecting or influencing your anxiety? I would bet dollars to donuts it doesn't help. It usually hurts or increases the anxiety around things. So why is it helpful to talk about unhelpful thinking patterns? Well, first of all, it increases awareness of what's going on. Remember, like I said, your brain has these shortcuts, these macros that it will go to really fast, and we might not even be aware that we're falling into this pattern. And so recognizing what these unhelpful thinking styles are can help us recognize or become more aware of what we're engaging in. And once we have more awareness, we can get off autopilot, right? Now we have an opportunity to not necessarily go down that same path. We can actually think a little bit differently, or at least question whether that pattern is appropriate for the scenario. And when we get off autopilot, that means we now have an opportunity to start to change those brain macros, right? Eventually, the same way you can reprogram a macro in something like Excel or whatever software, you can reprogram your brain. And that's what we're eventually going to be moving towards in this Anxiety Toolbox series. Because remember, changing the way you think about a situation can have a huge impact on how you feel about it. And once we start to recognize, well, what are these unhelpful patterns in terms of how we're thinking or approaching a situation, then we have an opportunity to start changing them. For additional info, please check out the worksheets that are associated with this video over at the CAPS website. We've got a cross-sectional formulation, which I walked students through in the first video that talks about the cognitive model. You can always review that as a refresher. And then there's also the Unhelpful Thinking Styles PDF. Feel free to download those because that might help you as you're starting to identify, well, what are some of the patterns that you engage with? And if you complete the cross sectional formulation, you'll actually have some data to work from. Like you can look at those thoughts that you've identified and actually start thinking about, like, oh, yeah, that fits this pattern or this other pattern. Other helpful resources, check out our Sandelo app. It helps with stress, anxiety, depression. We've got lots of cool meditations on there. And if you use your Tamu email address, you unlock all the premium features for free. It's already paid for you. Other cool resources include Mind Over Mood, great workbook, Psychology Today that has lots of information on anxiety basics. And of course, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America has a great info page if you'd like to learn more about coping with anxiety. Thank you very much and stay tuned for another installment.